There is a profound paradox we must confront. The nicest people, the ones who offer the most kindness and support, often end up being the most lonely. At first glance, this seems counterintuitive. You might think that people who are good-hearted, generous, and selfless would naturally be surrounded by friends, loved ones, and companionship. And yet, time and again, we find that those who give the most can end up isolated. So why is this the case? First, it's important to understand the nature of human relationships. People are drawn to those who share common interests and values, but they are also influenced by the dynamics of power, vulnerability, and reciprocity. A person who is always giving, who is always helping others, can inadvertently position themselves in a one-sided relationship. They may be seen as a provider, someone whose needs are secondary, someone whose needs are secondary. The problem with this is that relationships require balance, mutual exchange, and the nicest people often forget to ask for what they need in return. Another contributing factor is that nice people often lack the ability to assert boundaries. They're afraid of being seen as selfish or unkind, so they don't enforce limits on others' demands. But this failure to set boundaries means that they become exhausted, drained, and resentful. They end up giving too much without receiving enough. And over time, this can lead to isolation. The nicest people often become overwhelmed by others' expectations, and when they don't assert themselves, they unintentionally push others away. Furthermore, there is a tendency for those who are constantly nice to avoid conflict at all costs. Conflict is often seen as the enemy of peace, but in reality, it is through healthy conflict that relationships grow. Avoiding confrontation may seem like a way to keep the peace, but it often means that important issues go unaddressed, resentment builds, and the person becomes more and more isolated. Healthy relationships require honest communication, even if it's uncomfortable. The nicest people also tend to have high standards when it comes to their interactions. They seek genuine connection, which is an admirable goal. But sometimes this can lead to an unrealistic expectation of others. Not everyone is capable of meeting those high standards. And when they don't, the nicest person may retreat further into solitude, discouraged and disappointed by the lack of authenticity around them. Additionally, people who are too nice may fail to nurture their own emotional needs. They focus so much on others that they neglect themselves. In doing so, they deprive themselves of the very things they need to feel whole: emotional connection, understanding, and empathy. When you give everything away without replenishing yourself, you end up empty. And it's hard to reach out to others when you don't feel that you have anything left to give. So the idea that the nicest people are often the loneliest can also be explained by the fact that they are frequently misunderstood. People may see kindness as a form of weakness, or they may take advantage of the person's generosity. As a result, the nicest people may end up surrounded by those who exploit them or take them for granted, leaving them with a deep sense of disillusionment and alienation. Another issue arises when the nicest person seeks validation from others to feel worthy or loved. When they place their sense of self-worth in the hands of others, they become vulnerable to rejection and disappointment. This dependence on others for validation can lead to a feeling of loneliness, even when surrounded by people. It is only by finding value within oneself that true companionship can flourish. Sister Teresa, lastly, the nicest people sometimes make the mistake of avoiding the complexity of human nature. They may believe that everything should be simple and good, and in doing so, they overlook the difficult, often dark aspects of life that everyone carries within them. Relationships that avoid addressing these complexities often lack depth, and as a result, the nicest person may find themselves feeling misunderstood and isolated. The first key point centers on the imbalance in relationships that often arises when the nicest people are involved. This imbalance typically manifests as a one-sided dynamic where the nicest individual gives much more than they receive in return. It is essential to understand the nature of these relationships to grasp how this imbalance leads to loneliness. When we think of relationships, we often imagine them as partnerships where both individuals bring something to the table. This could be emotional support, shared experiences, intellectual exchange, or even simple companionship. For a relationship to be healthy and sustainable, there must be an equal exchange between both parties. However, when one person consistently gives without expecting anything in return, the balance is disrupted. The nicest people, by their nature, often prioritize the needs of others over their own. They give freely, whether it's their time, emotional labor, or material resources, and they do so without hesitation or a sense of calculation. They want to help, to be of service, and to make others feel valued. This generosity of spirit is admirable, but it can create a situation where their role becomes that of a perpetual provider. In this profession, social service is a framework to help the wealthy be the best version of themselves as well. The more they give, the more they may be perceived as someone who exists solely to meet the needs of others. In such relationships, the other person may begin to take the nice individual's giving nature for granted. They may start to expect help or support without offering anything in return, because the nice person never sets a clear boundary or communicates their own needs. The nicest people are often so focused on making others feel comfortable or content that they fail to recognize their own emotional depletion or to ask for support when they need it. This leads to an unspoken but very real imbalance. Furthermore, this dynamic can be exacerbated when the nicest people are constantly sought out for advice, emotional support, or assistance. Others may view them as a safe haven, a reliable person who will always be there without question. While this can be fulfilling in the short term, over time it can create a sense of being used or taken for granted. The nice person may feel that they are valued only for what they can give, not for who they are. This lack of recognition for their intrinsic value can lead to feelings of alienation and loneliness, even though they may be surrounded by people who depend on them. As the imbalance deepens, the nice person may begin to feel isolated, despite the apparent outward connection with others. They may have friends, family, or colleagues who rely on them, but there is a stark difference between being needed and being truly known or appreciated. The nicest individuals may find themselves feeling disconnected from others because their relationships are primarily transactional, with little emotional reciprocity or mutual vulnerability. Moreover, the nicest people are often reluctant to express dissatisfaction or to demand what they need from others. They fear that doing so will be perceived as selfish or unkind, or worse, that it will drive others away. This fear of rejection or abandonment can trap them in a cycle of giving without receiving, because they are unwilling to rock the boat or confront the underlying imbalance. As a result, they suppress their own desires, needs, and frustrations, which only deepens their sense of isolation. It's important to note that this imbalance is not always intentional on the part of others. Many people who take advantage of the nicest individuals may not even realize they are doing so. They may be unaware of how much the other person is giving, or they may believe that their needs are more urgent or pressing. But the impact on the nice person is still significant. Over time, the nicest individuals may begin to feel that they are invisible, that they are valued only for their utility rather than their personhood. I don't know that that case was one way on this civil rights issue or case, but it was inclusive. This imbalance also leads to a sense of exhaustion and emotional burnout. Constantly being the one who gives, who provides, and who supports others can take a significant toll on mental and physical well-being. The nicest individuals may start to feel drained, not only because they are giving too much, but also because they have no outlet through which to receive care and attention. This depletion, combined with the lack of emotional reciprocity, leaves them vulnerable to loneliness. In some cases, this one-sided dynamic may even cause the nicest people to question their worth. If they are constantly pouring themselves into others without receiving acknowledgement or affection in return, they may begin to wonder if they are truly valued. This lack of recognition can erode their self-esteem and lead to feelings of emptiness and disillusionment. This assumption resident says that self-acceptance and rejection caused by other people's actions is our fourth level of understanding. We may begin to wonder if they are truly valued. Ultimately, the imbalance in relationships for the nicest people is not just about the quantity of what is given and received, but about the deeper emotional connection that is often absent. While the nicest people are busy caring for others, they may find themselves disconnected from the core of what makes relationships meaningful: mutual understanding, respect, and the sharing of vulnerabilities. The key to making life meaningful. When this essential emotional exchange is lacking, the relationship becomes imbalanced, and the nicest individual is left feeling lonely despite their outward connections. The second key point highlights the failure of the nicest people to set boundaries, which is a significant factor contributing to their loneliness. Boundaries are essential in any healthy relationship. Yet many of the nicest individuals struggle with setting them. They tend to prioritize the needs of others above their own, driven by a desire to be helpful, supportive, and liked. This tendency can lead to them becoming overburdened and emotionally drained, as they fail to protect their own well-being by establishing clear limits on how much they can give. Boundaries are an invisible line that defines where one person ends and another begins. They are the mental, emotional, and physical limits we set in order to protect our own space, feelings, and energy. Boundaries allow us to engage with others in a healthy and respectful way, and they help us maintain a sense of self-respect and dignity. For most people, boundaries come naturally, as they understand that it's important to safeguard their time, energy, and emotions. However, for the nicest people, there is often a fear that setting boundaries might be perceived as selfish, rude, or unkind. As a result, they neglect to enforce these boundaries, inadvertently putting others' needs ahead of their own. One of the key reasons the nicest people struggle with boundaries is their deep-seated desire to please others. They want to be liked, admired, and appreciated, and they believe that by saying yes to every request and offering help at every opportunity, they will earn the affection and respect of those around them. They are often motivated by a genuine desire to help, to alleviate the suffering of others, and to make a positive impact. Unfortunately, this drive to please others can lead them to overextend themselves, taking on responsibilities that aren't theirs to bear. By neglecting to set limits on what they are willing and able to do, they become overwhelmed and begin to feel resentful. The problem with this lack of boundaries is that it creates a cycle of emotional depletion. The nicest people may give endlessly to others, but they receive very little in return. Because they haven't set clear expectations, they don't feel comfortable asking for help when they need it. As a result, they grow weary, physically and emotionally exhausted, and eventually they become isolated. They may begin to feel that they are being taken advantage of, or that others only value them for their generosity rather than for who they are as a person. This sense of being unappreciated deepens their loneliness. Moreover, the inability to set boundaries can lead to the nicest people becoming overly involved in the lives of others. They may take on too much responsibility, trying to solve everyone's problems, or offering constant advice and support. While these actions are often driven by good intentions, they can create unhealthy dynamics. The people who receive the nicest person's help may start to become dependent on them, expecting their support at all times, without offering anything in return. This dependency only reinforces the idea that the nice person exists to serve others, not to be treated as an equal partner in the relationship. The nicest individuals often find it difficult to say no or to assert their needs, especially when it comes to setting boundaries with loved ones. They fear that if they refuse a request or express their own needs, they will be seen as uncaring or unkind. This fear is particularly strong when it comes to family and close friends, as they don't want to disappoint those they love. However, by failing to communicate their limits, they allow others to overstep, which can lead to feelings of being overwhelmed and disconnected. When boundaries are not respected, the nicest person may start to feel used, as though their time and energy are being consumed, without regard for their own needs or desires. Find a balance, however, and determine whether that balance is going to be respected rather than withdrawn. Another key challenge for the nicest people is that they often struggle to recognize when they are overextending themselves. Their desire to help others can cloud their judgment, making it difficult for them to see when they are crossing their own personal boundaries. They may say yes out of obligation or guilt, without fully considering the toll it will take on their emotional or physical well-being. This lack of awareness can result in burnout, as they continue to give without stopping to assess how much they have left to offer. Over time, the nicest people may also begin to feel resentment. They may grow frustrated with the constant demands placed on them, yet feel powerless to say no. This internal conflict can erode the sense of fulfillment they once derived from helping others. They may even withdraw emotionally, distancing themselves from relationships altogether because they feel that their boundaries are not respected. The client may quickly end up leaving the relationship. This withdrawal only deepens their isolation as they begin to believe that they are not worthy of the same care and attention they so freely give to others. In the end, the inability to set boundaries is a major contributing factor to the loneliness of the nicest people. Without clear limits in place, they become overburdened, emotionally drained, and resentful. They may feel unappreciated, undervalued, and isolated from those around them. To break this cycle, the nicest people must learn to recognize their own needs, assert their boundaries, and prioritize their own well-being. Only by doing so can they avoid emotional exhaustion and cultivate healthier, more balanced relationships that are based on mutual respect and understanding. The third key point revolves around the avoidance of conflict by the nicest people, which is another significant factor contributing to their loneliness. Conflict is often perceived as something negative, something that disrupts peace and harmony. For the nicest individuals, this perception is particularly strong as they value kindness, cooperation, and the maintenance of good relations with others. As a result, they tend to go to great lengths to avoid any situation that could lead to disagreement, confrontation, or discord. While avoiding conflict may seem like a way to keep the peace, it can in fact undermine their relationships and contribute to emotional isolation. When the nicest people avoid conflict, they often do so out of a desire to protect the feelings of others. They do not want to hurt anyone, upset anyone, or cause any emotional distress. They fear that confronting difficult issues or engaging in a disagreement will lead to rejection or alienation. This fear can be particularly acute in close relationships, such as with family members, friends, or romantic partners. The nicest people may worry that by addressing a concern or expressing dissatisfaction, they will be perceived as selfish, mean, or ungrateful. This fear of being seen as difficult or uncaring leads them to suppress their feelings and avoid expressing their true emotions. However, avoiding conflict in this way can create a sense of internal tension. The nicest people may have strong feelings about certain issues, but instead of addressing them, they bottle them up inside. And you can't run from your feelings, and they do have a way of moving forward, like a wave. Over time, these unresolved issues can fester, leading to frustration, resentment, and emotional exhaustion. The act of suppressing feelings takes a toll on mental and emotional well-being, as it prevents the individual from dealing with their concerns in a healthy and constructive way. This internal turmoil can contribute to feelings of isolation, as the person struggles to reconcile their desire for harmony with the emotional weight of unresolved issues. Moreover, the avoidance of conflict often leads to communication breakdowns. When the nicest individuals fail to express their thoughts or concerns, others may remain unaware of the underlying tension. Without open and honest communication, relationships become shallow and one-dimensional. And logically, relationships become shallow and one-dimensional. The nicest people may start to feel as though they are not being truly heard or understood. They may find themselves stuck in relationships where their needs, desires, and emotions are not acknowledged or addressed. This lack of meaningful communication can create a sense of emotional distance, even when the person is physically surrounded by others. Her partners often have to go through this and discuss it with others, in some cases audaciously. In some cases, the avoidance of conflict can even lead to resentment. When the nicest people consistently suppress their own needs and desires in order to avoid confrontation, they may begin to feel as though they are giving too much without receiving enough in return. They may become frustrated with others for not recognizing their sacrifices, or for not offering the same level of care and consideration. However, because they are reluctant to express their dissatisfaction, this frustration is never addressed. Instead, it builds quietly over time, leading to a sense of bitterness and alienation. This silent resentment can ultimately drive the nicest people further away from those around them as they withdraw emotionally in order to protect themselves from the pain of feeling unappreciated. The right relationships can be very effective. An independent relationship as a whole is the template for learning to embrace diversity and for strengthening relationships. Healthy relationships require vulnerability, honesty, and the willingness to face difficult conversations. When people avoid conflict, they miss out on the opportunity to truly understand one another. Difficult discussions, whether about personal boundaries, differing values, or unresolved grievances, are often necessary for growth and for strengthening relationships. By avoiding these conversations, the nicest people miss the chance to engage with others on a deeper level. Relationships that lack this level of honesty and openness can feel superficial, and the nicest people may find themselves questioning whether they are truly known or loved for who they are, rather than for what they provide. In this lecture, I'll roll together, and all three of you will leave the lecture encouraged. Another consequence of conflict avoidance is that it can reinforce unhealthy patterns in relationships. The nicest people may allow others to take advantage of them or to behave in ways that are hurtful. The fourth key point addresses the unrealistic expectations that the nicest people often place on their relationships, contributing to their loneliness. Many nice individuals seek deep, authentic connections with others, connections that go beyond superficial interactions or casual acquaintances. They crave genuine relationships where vulnerability, mutual understanding, and shared values are the foundation. But while this is a noble and worthwhile aspiration, it can also create a significant challenge. The nicest people may set such high standards for their relationships that, over time, they become disillusioned when others fall short of these expectations. This disconnect between what they hope for and the reality of their relationships often leads to a profound sense of loneliness. When the nicest people enter relationships, whether romantic, familial, or platonic, they often do so with an idealized vision of what the relationship should be. They envision open communication, unwavering support, and an effortless bond that transcends conflict. These expectations are rooted in their desire for deep emotional connection and a genuine sense of belonging. However, the reality of human relationships is far more complex and messy than this ideal. People are flawed, and they come from different backgrounds with different values, needs, and emotional capacities. It is unrealistic to expect that every person will meet the high standards set by the nicest individuals. One of the reasons this creates loneliness is that the nicest people can become frustrated when their idealized vision of relationships doesn't materialize. They may invest significant emotional energy into fostering a close, meaningful connection, only to find that the other person is not as invested or capable of meeting their needs. They might feel disappointed when others fail to live up to the expectations of deep emotional engagement, consistency, or loyalty. This sense of disappointment can be isolating, as the nicest people may start to question their own worth, or wonder why they are not receiving the same level of emotional investment they are giving. Furthermore, the nicest people may find themselves withdrawing from relationships that don't meet their standards, even when the relationships themselves are not inherently unhealthy. For instance, they may feel that a friendship is lacking because it doesn't involve the same level of intimacy or emotional depth they desire. They may also become discouraged if a romantic partner doesn't share the same values or emotional openness. In some cases, this leads to a sense of frustration and eventual withdrawal as the nicest people stop making the effort to maintain relationships that don't seem to offer the depth and authenticity they long for. Over time, these unmet expectations create a gap between the nicest people and those around them fostering loneliness. Additionally, the nicest individuals may place unrealistic expectations on themselves in relationships. They often hold themselves to the highest standard of care, empathy, and selflessness. They may feel responsible for managing the emotional well-being of others, constantly trying to meet everyone's needs without ever taking the time to assess their own. This self-imposed pressure to be perfect can lead to emotional burnout and exhaustion. They may also feel resentful when their efforts aren't reciprocated, but because their expectations are so high, they struggle to communicate these feelings effectively. Instead, they bottle up their frustration, which only deepens their sense of isolation. Another factor contributing to unrealistic expectations is that the nicest people may idealize relationships as a means of escaping the challenges and complexities of life. They may hold on to the belief that if they find the right people, the relationships will be effortless and fulfilling, and that these relationships will fill the void within them. This belief is rooted in a desire for security, love, and emotional fulfillment. However, this expectation sets them up for disappointment, as no relationship is without its challenges. When conflicts arise, as they inevitably do, the nicest people may feel betrayed or disillusioned. They might feel that if a relationship truly mattered, it would never involve hardship or disagreement. This unrealistic belief can prevent them from seeing the value in imperfect relationships and ultimately drive them further into loneliness. Moreover, the nicest people may have trouble recognizing and accepting that relationships take work. Authentic connections require time, effort, compromise, and most importantly, mutual understanding. They cannot be sustained solely by giving or by meeting the needs of others. Yet the nicest people often place all their energy into making others happy, which leaves little room for their own emotional growth. I hear the most often. These are the people who say to me, this one-sided dynamic fueled by unrealistic expectations leads to an emotional imbalance that creates feelings of loneliness and disconnection. Finally, the nicest people may develop a sense of disillusionment with the idea of relationships altogether. As they face repeated disappointments and unmet expectations, they may begin to believe that meaningful connections are rare or unattainable. This pessimism can make them hesitant to invest in future relationships, as they fear that their high standards will once again lead to frustration and loneliness. In this way, their desire for authentic connection, when combined with unrealistic expectations, can drive them into a cycle of emotional isolation. That's the key issue with unrealistic expectations, is that they prevent the nicest people from accepting and appreciating the imperfections that are intrinsic to all relationships. No connection is perfect, and no person is capable of meeting every need or fulfilling every emotional expectation. Only by recognizing the beauty and value in imperfection can the nicest individuals begin to cultivate relationships that are both realistic and fulfilling. Poverty leads to despair and grief, and the conviction that the nicest individuals begin to cultivate relationships that are both realistic and fulfilling. Without this shift in perspective, however, they may continue to struggle with feelings of loneliness, disappointment, and disillusionment. The fifth key point focuses on the difficulty the nicest people face in prioritizing their own well-being, which contributes to their sense of loneliness. This challenge stems from the selflessness that characterizes many nice individuals. While being kind, empathetic, and generous can strengthen relationships and foster connection, it can also come at a significant personal cost if they neglect their own needs and emotional health. When the nicest people consistently place others before themselves, they risk losing sight of their own identities, desires, and boundaries, leading to a deep sense of isolation. At the core of this issue is the fact that the nicest individuals are often conditioned to prioritize others' needs over their own. From a young age, many of these people are taught to be accommodating, helpful, and considerate, often receiving praise for their willingness to put others first. Over time, this behavior becomes ingrained to the point where they may feel guilty or selfish for taking time for themselves or seeking out their own happiness. They become so accustomed to putting others' needs at the forefront that they overlook their own emotional or physical well-being. This tendency to neglect themselves can manifest in various ways. For example, the nicest people may constantly sacrifice their own time and energy to help others, whether it's offering emotional support, running errands, or taking on responsibilities that don't belong to them. While these actions may come from a place of genuine care and concern, they often result in emotional depletion. The nicest individuals may find themselves drained, exhausted, and overwhelmed by the demands of others, but they continue to give because they believe that their own needs are secondary. Over time, this continuous cycle of giving without receiving can lead to burnout and a profound sense of emotional isolation. One of the reasons the nicest people struggle to prioritize themselves is because they feel a deep sense of responsibility for the happiness and well-being of those around them. They are empathetic, deeply attuned to the emotions of others, and often feel responsible for alleviating others' struggles. However, this responsibility becomes a heavy burden when they do not take the time to care for themselves. The nicest people may feel that if they were to focus on their own needs, they would be abandoning others or failing in their role as the helper or supporter. This can lead to a distorted sense of self-worth where their value is tied to their ability to meet the needs of others. This dynamic makes it incredibly difficult for them to recognize when they need to step back and recharge. The nicest individuals may also struggle to identify their own desires, as they have spent so much time focusing on others. They may become disconnected from their own passions, goals, or needs because they are constantly tending to the needs of friends, family, and colleagues. Over time, this lack of attention to their own inner world can create a sense of emptiness or confusion. They may find themselves asking, "What do I really want?" but struggle to answer because they have never taken the time to reflect on their own wants and desires. Additionally, the nicest people often find it difficult to ask for help when they need it. They may have a deep-seated fear of burdening others, and so they silently carry their own struggles without sharing them. They are quick to offer assistance, but slow to admit when they are overwhelmed. This lack of communication about their own needs further isolates them, as they do not create opportunities for others to support them in return. As a result, they may feel as though they are giving endlessly without receiving the same level of care, which leads to feelings of loneliness and emotional deprivation. Moreover, the nicest people often feel that they must always be on for others. They feel an unspoken pressure to maintain an image of perfection, to always be the reliable, supportive, and caring person that others depend on. This can create a sense of inauthenticity as they suppress their own vulnerabilities and true emotions to maintain this facade. They may fear that if they show weakness or express their own needs, they will be rejected or seen as inadequate. This constant effort to meet external expectations while ignoring their own internal needs further deepens their sense of disconnection from others. Another consequence of not prioritizing their own well-being is that the nicest people may experience a profound lack of self-care. They may neglect their physical health, emotional well-being, or personal boundaries in order to cater to others. For instance, they might stay up late helping a friend with a problem even though they are exhausted and need rest. They may skip meals or ignore their own mental health in favor of being there for someone else. This neglect can lead to physical fatigue, emotional instability, and a diminished sense of self-worth. When they fail to take care of themselves, they are more likely to feel drained, irritable, and disconnected from others. Ultimately, the nicest people often struggle to ask themselves what they need, let alone take the steps necessary to fulfill those needs. This lack of self-prioritization leads to a cycle of emotional exhaustion and isolation. The more they give without receiving, the more they lose sight of their own needs, desires, and sense of identity. Over time, they may feel disconnected not only from others, but also from themselves. Unfortunately, the more people keep giving to the point where they lose sight of their own self-worth, and the better they feel within themselves. This internal disconnection, combined with the external loneliness that arises from unbalanced relationships, creates a profound sense of isolation. It is only when the nicest people begin to recognize the importance of self-care, set boundaries, and allow themselves to receive as much as they give, that they can break free from this cycle and cultivate healthier, more fulfilling relationships. Self-care means letting go of self-interest, self-absorption, and cultivate healthier, more fulfilling relationships. The sixth key point addresses the tendency of the nicest people to avoid vulnerability, which significantly contributes to their loneliness. Vulnerability is the act of opening oneself up to others, exposing one's true emotions, fears, and desires, without the guarantee of being accepted or understood. For many nice individuals, vulnerability is perceived as a weakness, something that can potentially leave them hurt, rejected, or misunderstood. First, this fear of being vulnerable prevents them from fully engaging in relationships and can lead to a sense of emotional isolation, even when they are surrounded by others. The nicest people often feel compelled to maintain a facade of strength, positivity, and resilience. They want to be seen as capable, dependable, and supportive, always ready to help others with a smile on their face. However, this desire to maintain a certain image comes at a cost. It requires them to hide their true feelings, fears, and insecurities. They may believe that by revealing their vulnerabilities, they will be seen as weak, needy, or even a burden to others. As a result, they may suppress their emotions, pretending everything is fine, even when they are struggling internally. This self-imposed emotional armor keeps others at a distance, preventing the formation of deeper, more intimate connections. At the core of this fear of vulnerability is the belief that if they expose their true selves, they will be judged, rejected, or abandoned. The nicest people often place a great deal of value on being liked, admired, and appreciated by others. They fear that showing their weaknesses or emotional struggles will lead others to see them as flawed or unworthy of love and support. They may have internalized the idea that being perfect or strong is necessary to maintain relationships, and this belief keeps them from revealing their authentic selves. The irony, however, is that this fear of vulnerability can create the very distance they seek to avoid. By keeping their emotions hidden, they prevent others from truly knowing them, which ultimately contributes to feelings of loneliness. Another reason the nicest people avoid vulnerability is that they are afraid of being a burden to others. They may fear that their emotional needs or struggles will be too much for their friends, family, or romantic partners to handle. In their desire to avoid imposing on others, they keep their struggles to themselves, often isolating themselves in the process. This self-sufficiency, though well-intentioned, can prevent them from forming deep emotional bonds with others. Relationships thrive on mutual support and emotional exchange, and by withholding their own vulnerabilities, the nicest people limit the depth of connection they can have with others. The avoidance of vulnerability also stems from a lack of trust in others. The nicest individuals may have experienced betrayal, rejection, or emotional pain in the past, which makes them hesitant to open up again. These past experiences can create emotional scars that make it difficult to trust others with their innermost feelings. They may fear that if they allow themselves to be vulnerable, they will be hurt again. So they choose to protect themselves by remaining emotionally closed off. This fear of vulnerability creates a barrier between them and others, preventing them from forming truly authentic relationships. Furthermore, the nicest people often feel that they need to be the ones offering support, not the ones receiving it. They are used to being the caregiver, the listener, the helper, the one who is always there for others. This role can become so ingrained that they find it difficult to ask for help or accept emotional support from others. They may feel that if they were to lean on someone else, they would be imposing or being selfish. Sometimes they believe that it is their duty to impose boundaries. This dynamic can create an unbalanced relationship where the nicest person gives and gives, but never allows themselves to receive, further isolating them emotionally. There is also a societal expectation that people should be strong and self-sufficient, which compounds the fear of vulnerability. From a young age, many are taught to hide their emotions and to tough it out in difficult situations. This cultural conditioning reinforces the idea that vulnerability is something to be avoided, particularly for those who are seen as nurturing or caring. In addition, that means we need to change the way we think about courage and what it means to be strong, brave, and successful. The nicest people may internalize these messages, believing that they must always be emotionally resilient and composed, regardless of how they feel. As a result, they suppress their true emotions, avoiding vulnerability even when it would benefit them to open up. The avoidance of vulnerability can also lead to emotional numbness. Over time, the nicest people may become so accustomed to hiding their feelings that they no longer know how to express them. They may lose touch with their own emotions, unable to differentiate between what they truly feel and what they think they should feel. This emotional numbness can create a sense of emptiness as they feel disconnected from their own inner world. Additionally, it makes it difficult for them to engage with others on a deeper, more authentic level, which only contributes to their feelings of isolation. The seventh key point addresses the internal conflict that the nicest people experience between their desire for acceptance and the fear of being rejected, which often leads to their loneliness. At the heart of this internal struggle is the desire to be loved and appreciated by others, combined with the fear that showing their true selves will result in rejection, abandonment, or emotional harm. This conflict creates a paradox. The more the nicest people try to gain acceptance through their actions, the more they may distance themselves from others as they become increasingly fearful of not measuring up to the expectations they have set for themselves or that others have set for them. Many of the nicest individuals have a deep-rooted need to be liked, valued, and respected by those around them. This need for approval often drives them to act in ways that ensure others are happy, comfortable, or satisfied. They go out of their way to be helpful, generous, and empathetic, even at the expense of their own emotional well-being. However, this constant pursuit of acceptance can become exhausting, as they are essentially trying to meet external expectations rather than authentically express who they are. The fear of being rejected for their true selves leads them to suppress aspects of their personality, desires, or feelings that they believe might not be well received. This internal conflict between the desire for acceptance and the fear of rejection creates a cycle of emotional confusion. On one hand, the nicest people feel compelled to please others, to be the person who is always there, always supportive, and always accommodating. They seek approval and reassurance from those around them, hoping that by fulfilling others' needs, they will be accepted and loved. On the other hand, there is a fear that if they are too honest, too open, or too authentic, they will be judged or abandoned. This fear of rejection leads them to hold back, to mask their true feelings, or to avoid expressing their personal needs. The more they try to control how others perceive them, the more they distance themselves from forming genuine connections. As the nicest people suppress their true selves in order to avoid rejection, they also begin to feel disconnected from those around them. Relationships built on superficial acts of kindness or on fulfilling external expectations are rarely fulfilling on a deep emotional level. The nicest people may begin to feel that their relationships are based on what they can give rather than who they truly are. They fear that if they stop being the perfect friend, partner, or family member, if they stop fulfilling others' expectations, they will lose the acceptance and love they crave. This fear of losing their place in the lives of others keeps them in a state of emotional tension where they are constantly performing rather than truly connecting. This desire for acceptance can also lead to self-doubt. The nicest people may question whether they are good enough, worthy enough, or deserving of love. They may measure their self-worth by how much they give or by how much they are needed by others. When they feel that they are not fulfilling this role to the highest standard, they may experience feelings of inadequacy or failure, as we described earlier in this show. So, how do we balance this juggling? The constant comparison of themselves to the idealized versions of how they think they should be creates emotional friction and contributes to their loneliness. They may feel as though they are never enough, no matter how hard they try, because their efforts are based on seeking external validation rather than cultivating internal self-acceptance. Another aspect of this internal conflict is that the nicest people often suppress their own needs and desires in favor of others. They may not want to ask for help or share their own vulnerabilities, fearing that doing so might burden others or lead to disappointment. They are so focused on being the person who gives, who supports, and who nurtures that they forget that they too are deserving of care and consideration. It's a funny thing, but we really need to ask our biggest friends for help, why it is so important to apply to them. This can create an emotional imbalance where they give endlessly but do not allow themselves to receive in return. When their emotional needs go unmet, they may feel invisible or unimportant, even as they continue to invest in others. This unacknowledged emotional depletion can lead to feelings of loneliness and isolation as they feel that no one truly sees or understands them. The nicest people also often experience a fear of being judged, particularly when they reveal their true selves. The more they try to meet external expectations, the more they become anxious about how others perceive them. They may be afraid that if they express their opinions, desires, or boundaries, they will be criticized or rejected. This fear can lead them to avoid difficult conversations or to suppress their true feelings, further deepening the emotional distance between themselves and others. The fear of judgment creates a barrier to authentic connection, as the nicest people become caught in a cycle of self-censorship, trying to control how they are seen rather than allowing themselves to be fully known. Over time, this internal conflict erodes the quality of their relationships. The nicest people may find themselves in relationships where they feel unappreciated or misunderstood, despite their best efforts to please others. They may struggle with feelings of loneliness because the connections they form are based on pleasing others or fulfilling external expectations, rather than on genuine emotional intimacy. So they may also begin to question their own sense of identity, as they become so focused on seeking acceptance that they lose touch with their authentic self. The more they try to please others, the more they risk feeling disconnected and isolated. Ultimately, the internal conflict between the desire for acceptance and the fear of rejection can create a deep sense of emotional loneliness. The nicest people are often caught between the need to be loved and the fear that being themselves will lead to rejection. This constant tension prevents them from forming genuine, fulfilling relationships, and it keeps them emotionally isolated, even when surrounded by others. But taking responsibility for their own actions is what motivates them. It is only by learning to accept themselves, to be vulnerable, and to stop performing for others that the nicest people can break free from this cycle and cultivate relationships that are truly meaningful and emotionally fulfilling. The eighth key point delves into the emotional exhaustion that the nicest people often experience due to their constant giving without receiving the same in return. This exhaustion occurs because the nicest individuals tend to prioritize others' needs above their own, constantly investing their time, energy, and emotional resources into helping others without ever taking the time to replenish themselves. While their acts of kindness and selflessness come from a genuine desire to make others happy, over time, this one-sided dynamic leads to a state of emotional depletion and isolation. The more they give, the more they feel drained, which can ultimately lead to feelings of loneliness. One of the reasons the nicest people experience emotional exhaustion is that they often feel a deep sense of responsibility for the well-being of others. They may have a strong desire to ease the suffering of those around them, whether it's offering advice, providing emotional support, or taking on burdens that aren't theirs to bear. This sense of responsibility can be overwhelming because, in their desire to help, they forget to take care of themselves. Yet they may feel that if they stop giving or if they set boundaries, they will let others down, which leads them to overextend themselves. They continue to give without pause, often at the expense of their own emotional or physical health. The nicest people may also feel that their worth is tied to how much they can do for others. They might measure their self-esteem by their ability to be helpful, to take care of others, or to solve problems for those around them. When they don't receive the same level of care or consideration in return, they may feel that they are not as valuable or important. This leads to feelings of inadequacy and frustration, as they realize that, despite their efforts, their emotional needs remain unmet. They give endlessly, but because their focus is always on others, they neglect their own emotional well-being, which leaves them feeling unfulfilled and isolated. Additionally, emotional exhaustion is compounded by the fact that the nicest people often have difficulty saying no. They may fear that refusing a request or setting a boundary will cause disappointment or strain in a relationship. This inability to set healthy boundaries means they end up taking on more than they can handle. Over time, this accumulation of obligations, whether in friendships, family, or work, leads to a sense of being overwhelmed. They may become mentally and physically drained, unable to keep up with the demands placed on them. As their energy is depleted, they struggle to maintain the same level of care and attention in their relationships, which may cause further strain and disconnection. They also no longer have the resources to grow their own food or feed themselves. And last but not least, they may become unable to get it. The nicest people often give without expecting anything in return. But this one-sided dynamic can create a sense of emotional imbalance. Relationships are built on reciprocity, mutual giving and receiving. When one person constantly gives while the other takes without offering emotional support in return, it creates a void. The nicest people may feel that they are giving everything they have, only to find that they are not receiving the emotional nourishment they need to thrive. This lack of emotional reciprocity fosters feelings of loneliness, as they realize that their contributions are not being acknowledged or reciprocated in meaningful ways. Moreover, emotional exhaustion can cause the nicest people to become resentful, even though they often don't recognize it at first. They may begin to feel frustrated by the constant demands placed on them, but because they fear conflict or want to maintain harmony, they bottle up their feelings. This unspoken resentment gradually builds, making them feel emotionally distant and disconnected from others. They may feel like they are being taken advantage of, but because they have a deep-seated desire to please, they avoid expressing these feelings out of fear of confrontation or rejection. Another factor contributing to emotional exhaustion is that the nicest people tend to take on the emotional burdens of others. They often absorb the pain, struggles, and challenges of those around them, whether it's listening to a friend's problems or supporting a partner through a difficult time. While empathy is a valuable quality, it can be draining when the nicest people take on too much emotional weight without giving themselves the opportunity to process their own feelings. This emotional contagion can leave them feeling overwhelmed, as they are constantly absorbing the negative energy of others without creating space for their own healing. Successfully experiencing overwhelmment is realizing perspective. It is when we resist this that we are hurt. In addition to the emotional exhaustion, the nicest people may also experience a lack of fulfillment in their relationships. They may feel that their emotional energy is being spent on others who are not offering the same level of care or consideration. This imbalance can lead to a sense of emptiness, as they feel that their needs are being neglected. They may start to question the authenticity of their relationships, wondering whether people genuinely care for them or if they are simply taking advantage of their kindness. This questioning of the motives of others can further deepen their sense of loneliness, as they realize that, despite their selfless efforts, they do not feel truly seen or valued in return. The emotional exhaustion that comes from constantly giving without receiving can also lead to a sense of identity loss. The nicest people often define themselves by their roles as caregivers, supporters, or problem solvers. When they become emotionally drained, they may struggle to recognize who they are outside of these roles. They may feel disconnected from their own desires, passions, and needs, because they have spent so much time focusing on others. This loss of self can lead to feelings of confusion and isolation, as they no longer know what they want or need in their own lives. Ultimately, the nicest people experience loneliness because their emotional exhaustion leaves them disconnected from both others and themselves. They give endlessly, but because they do not prioritize their own emotional health, they find themselves drained and unfulfilled. The key to breaking this cycle is for the nicest individuals to learn the importance of self-care, boundary setting, and emotional reciprocity. They need to recognize that they are deserving of the same level of care and attention that they so willingly offer to others. Only by nurturing their own emotional well-being can they avoid burnout and create healthier, more balanced relationships that provide the support and fulfillment they need to thrive. In conclusion, the loneliness experienced by the nicest people is rooted in a complex web of psychological and emotional dynamics. These individuals, driven by a deep-seated desire to help and be liked, often suppress their true selves, fearing rejection, judgment, and the vulnerability that comes with authentic connection. Their selflessness, while admirable, often leads to emotional exhaustion as they give endlessly without receiving the same level of care or consideration in return. The inability to set boundaries, coupled with the fear of being a burden to others, further isolates them, creating a cycle of loneliness that is difficult to break. Moreover, their internal conflict between the need for acceptance and the fear of rejection keeps them from forming deeper, more meaningful relationships. Ultimately, the nicest people are trapped in a paradox. In their efforts to please others and maintain a facade of strength and self-sufficiency, they create emotional distance that leads to feelings of isolation. Their kindness, though genuine, is often unreciprocated, and their emotional needs remain unmet. To break free from this cycle, they must learn to embrace vulnerability, set healthy boundaries, and prioritize their own emotional well-being. It is only by being authentic and allowing themselves to receive support in return for the care they give that they can build the deeper, more meaningful connections they truly desire. What more could you want out of a partner than having them listen to you, see the world the same way you do, and prioritize their own emotional well-being? It is only by being authentic and allowing themselves to receive support in return for the care they give that they can build the deeper, more meaningful connections they truly desire. By doing so, they can find the balance between giving and receiving and ultimately overcome the loneliness that has long defined their experiences.